What if the wisest man in Athens was executed not because of his ignorance, but because of his relentless pursuit of truth, truth so dangerous that it threatened the very foundation of society? This question is not just a hypothetical provocation, it is the paradox at the heart of Socrates' life. How could a city at the height of its cultural glory, the birthplace of democracy, drama, art, and philosophy, condemn to death a man who claimed he knew nothing, yet whose words and actions sparked the intellectual revolution that would shape the future of Western thought? To understand Socrates, we must step back into Athens of the 5th century BCE, a city that was both dazzling and fragile, filled with contradictions. It was a place of democratic ideals and political corruption, of stunning artistic achievements and devastating wars. Into this complex world steps Socrates, a man who challenged everything his fellow citizens thought they knew about justice, virtue, knowledge, and the purpose of life. Socrates was unlike the other thinkers of his age. He wrote nothing, he published no treatises, offered no systematic philosophy, and built no school in his lifetime. Instead, he roamed the streets, markets, and gathering places of Athens, engaging anyone who would listen or argue. His method was simple but devastating. Ask questions, expose contradictions, and leave his opponent with nothing but confusion and the realization that they did not, in fact, know what they thought they knew. This was more than clever debate. For Socrates, it was a mission. He saw himself as a gadfly, sent by the gods to sting Athens out of its complacency, forcing citizens to wake up to their own ignorance. But a gadfly is rarely welcome. His relentless questioning of politicians, poets, craftsmen, and even his own students earned him both admiration and resentment. Some saw him as a teacher of wisdom. Others saw him as a corrupter of youth, an enemy of tradition, and a destabilizing force in a city already weakened by war and political strife. When the city finally turned against him, the trial that followed was not just about one man, it was about the very struggle between truth and power, philosophy and politics, freedom of thought, and the fear of dissent. In this opening chapter, we set the stage for the life of a man who would rather die than stop questioning. We will trace the path of Socrates from his humble beginnings to the trial that made him immortal. We will explore the tension between his personal quest for virtue and the political landscape that ultimately condemned him. The story of Socrates is not just an ancient one, it is a story that still challenges us today. Do we truly want the truth, even when it is uncomfortable? Or do we prefer comforting illusions, even if it means silencing the voices that force us to think? As we begin this journey, let us hold on to the unsettling question. Did Athens execute its greatest philosopher because he was guilty of impiety and corruption, or because he revealed a deeper truth the city could not bear to face? To understand Socrates, one must first understand Athens. His life, his questions, his trial, and even his death cannot be separated from the city that raised him and ultimately condemned him. Athens in the 5th century BCE was both a beacon of human achievement and a crucible of political conflict. It was here, in this dazzling yet unstable environment, that Socrates became the gadfly of democracy. When Socrates was born around 469 BCE, Athens was entering what historians later called its golden age. Under leaders such as Pericles, the city flourished as never before. Temples rose on the Acropolis, including the magnificent Parthenon, whose marble columns gleamed under the Aegean sun. Sculptors like Phidias carved gods and heroes that seemed almost alive. Playwrights like Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes filled the theaters with tragedies and comedies that still move audiences today. Historians such as Herodotus and Thucydides were inventing new ways of recording human events, turning war and politics into lessons for future generations. Athens was also the birthplace of democracy, or at least the radical form of citizen rule that gave free male Athenians the right to vote, debate, and decide on laws together in the assembly. For many, this was a revolutionary experiment in freedom and equality, but it was also fragile, riddled with contradictions, and limited. Women, slaves, and foreigners had no political rights. Still, the idea that ordinary citizens could govern themselves without kings or tyrants was unprecedented. Athens' glory did not come without struggle. Socrates grew up in the shadow of the Persian Wars, when the mighty Persian Empire invaded Greece. The victory of Athens and its allies at battles like Marathon, 490 BCE, and Salamis, 480 BCE, gave Athenians immense pride and a sense of destiny. They began to see themselves as defenders of freedom against tyranny, champions of a new way of life that valued debate, inquiry, and the power of the citizen. Yet the very success of Athens sowed the seeds of conflict. The Delian League, originally an alliance of Greek city-states against Persia, became dominated by Athens. Its navy controlled the Aegean, and tribute from allies filled Athenian coffers. Wealth poured into the city, funding its monuments and festivals, but also breeding resentment among other states, especially Sparta, Athens' great rival. The stage was set for the Peloponnesian War, a decades-long conflict that would exhaust both Athens and Sparta and ultimately change Socrates' world forever. For ordinary Athenians, daily life was vibrant and full of contrasts. The agora, or marketplace, bustled with traders, craftsmen, and citizens discussing politics. Citizens gathered to listen to speeches, cast their votes, and serve on juries, giving Athens an energy unlike any other city in Greece. Festivals celebrated the gods with music, drama, and athletic competitions. Religion was woven into every part of life. Sacrifices, rituals, and processions honored Athena, Zeus, Apollo, and countless others. But beneath the surface lay tensions. Wealth was unevenly distributed. Many Athenians owned slaves whose labor sustained the economy. Women were largely confined to the home, their role centered on family and domestic duties, even as men pursued public life. And intellectual debates often clashed with traditional beliefs, creating friction between old ways and new ideas. The 5th century BCE was also a time of intellectual ferment. Sophists, professional teachers of rhetoric and philosophy, traveled from city to city, offering instruction in argument, politics, and the art of persuasion. To many young Athenians, they were exciting, offering new ways of thinking and the skills to succeed in public life. To critics, they were dangerous, teaching relativism and undermining traditional values. Into this world stepped Socrates, who was unlike the sophists in every way. He charged no fees, claimed no wisdom, and sought not to persuade but to question. He thrived in a city buzzing with debate, yet his mission set him against both the sophists and the politicians. In a city where public speaking could make or break a career, Socrates exposed the emptiness of rhetoric without truth. For Socrates, Athens was both the greatest of classrooms and the harshest of judges. It was a city that celebrated freedom of speech, but feared those who spoke too freely. It built temples to wisdom, yet distrusted the man who claimed the gods had given him a divine mission to question everything. This tension would define his life. Without Athens, Socrates could not have become Socrates. But because of Athens, he would be accused, tried, and sentenced to death. Socrates was born around 469 BCE in the deme of Alopechi, a suburb of Athens. Unlike the aristocratic philosophers who would later preserve his memory, Socrates' family background was modest. His father, Sophroniscus, was a stonemason and sculptor. His mother, Phaenaret, was a midwife. These origins were significant. They tied Socrates to the practical world of craftsmanship and birth. both of which would later echo in his philosophy. He often described himself as a midwife of ideas, helping others give birth to truths that lay hidden within them. Athens was not yet at the peak of its golden age when Socrates was a child, but the city was already vibrant with art, commerce, and democratic energy. As a boy, he would have grown up surrounded by myths, religious festivals, and the pride of his city's resistance against Persia. But unlike many ambitious Athenians, Socrates showed little interest in wealth, beauty, or prestige. His path would be different. Formal education in Athens was not as institutionalized as it is today. Boys learned grammar, poetry, music, and gymnastics, preparing them for citizenship and military service. Socrates, like others of his time, would have been exposed to Homer's epics, the songs of Hesiod, and the moral lessons embedded in Greek mythology. These tales of heroes, gods, and destiny shaped the imagination of every young Athenian. Yet Socrates also showed an unusual curiosity. He questioned stories, challenged assumptions, and sought definitions beyond the surface. While some young men pursued rhetoric to prepare for politics, Socrates pursued wisdom itself. We do not know which teachers influenced him directly, but historians suggest he may have encountered thinkers like Anaxagoras or Archelaus, who introduced him to the natural philosophy of Ionia, ideas about the cosmos, matter, and reason. However, unlike them, Socrates would soon abandon speculation about the heavens and turn his gaze inward to the soul and human virtue. Accounts from contemporaries describe Socrates as far from handsome. In fact, he was often ridiculed for his physical appearance. He had a stocky build, bulging eyes, a snub nose, and thick lips. Aristophanes, the comic playwright, caricatured him in the clouds as a ridiculous figure floating in a basket, lost in absurd speculation. Yet Socrates seemed indifferent to such mockery. He embraced simplicity, wearing the same cloak year-round, going barefoot, and eating frugally. His disregard for wealth and appearance would later become a hallmark of his character and a sharp contrast to the luxurious lifestyles of Athenian elites. Socrates was not just a thinker, he was also a soldier. He served as a hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman in several campaigns during the Peloponnesian Wars. Records suggest he fought bravely at Potidaea, Delium, and Amphipolis. At Potidaea, he reportedly saved the life of Alcibiades, a young aristocrat who would later become both a disciple and a controversial political figure. At Delium, he calmly retreated in order, rather than fleeing in panic, earning admiration for his courage and composure. This military service shaped Socrates profoundly. He knew firsthand the horrors of war, the fragility of human life, and the moral challenges of leadership. These experiences deepened his conviction that true courage was not reckless daring, but a disciplined commitment to what is just and right. His philosophy of virtue was not born in abstract speculation alone, it was forged in the dust and blood of the battlefield. Despite his ascetic habits, Socrates did marry. His wife, Xanthippe, became legendary, often portrayed in later stories as sharp-tempered and difficult. Some accounts may exaggerate her character, using her as a symbol of domestic strife. Yet Socrates and Xanthippe had 3 sons together, and by all accounts, he fulfilled his role as a father, even if his dedication to philosophy often pulled him away from home. In Plato's Phaedo, Xanthippe appears tearful when Socrates prepares for execution, a reminder that behind the philosopher stood a family deeply affected by his fate. From his humble origins, Socrates learned the value of labor, simplicity, and endurance. From his education, he absorbed the myths and teachings of Greek tradition, while also developing the habit of questioning them. From his military service, he gained first-hand knowledge of courage, discipline, and the unpredictability of life. And from his family life, he experienced both the demands of responsibility and the sacrifices required by a higher calling. All these elements converged to shape the man who would later walk the streets of Athens, challenging everyone he met with questions that cut deeper than comfort allowed. Socrates' early life did not predict his destiny as philosophy's martyr, but it provided the foundation upon which his mission was built. Socrates' early years as the son of a stonemason suggested a simple trade-driven life. For a time, it is believed that he even followed his father's craft, shaping marble into statues. Some sources credit him with small works displayed in Athens. Yet, while stone could be carved into form, Socrates became more fascinated by the intangible truth, virtue, and the human spirit. His mother's profession as a midwife, guiding new life into the world, left an equally profound mark. Later, Socrates would call himself a midwife of ideas, suggesting that his role was not to implant knowledge, but to help others give birth to the wisdom already within them. During his youth, Greek philosophy was dominated by natural inquiry. Thinkers like Thales, Heraclitus, and Anaxagoras asked questions about the cosmos. What is the universe made of? What is the origin of change? These were bold questions, and Socrates was drawn to them, but he soon became disillusioned. While others tried to explain the stars, the seasons, or the elements, Socrates began asking a different set of questions. What is justice? What is virtue? What does it mean to live a good life? He later explained that he turned away from natural philosophy because it offered little guidance for how one should live. Knowing what the heavens were made of did not tell a person how to act with honor, courage, or integrity. For Socrates, philosophy had to serve human life directly. It had to guide the soul, not just describe the sky. One of the defining moments of Socrates' life came when his friend Chaerephon visited the oracle at Delphi. The oracle, regarded as the voice of Apollo, declared that no man was wiser than Socrates. When Socrates heard this, he was baffled. He did not consider himself wise at all. In fact, he often insisted, "I know that I know nothing." Determined to test the oracle's statement, Socrates began questioning prominent Athenians, politicians, poets, craftsmen, those reputed to have wisdom. Time and again, he found that while they claimed knowledge, their answers collapsed under scrutiny. They believed they knew what justice, courage, or beauty was, but their definitions contradicted themselves. Socrates realized that, unlike them, he was aware of his ignorance. This awareness, paradoxically, was a form of wisdom. The oracle had been right, though not in the way anyone expected. From this experience, Socrates concluded that the gods had given him a mission to challenge false wisdom and awaken Athenians to the pursuit of true virtue. He compared himself to a gadfly stinging a sluggish horse, Athens being the horse, and his questions being the sting. This mission was not easy, nor was it welcome. Many disliked being exposed as ignorant. Politicians resented him for undermining their authority. Poets disliked his claim that inspiration without understanding was shallow. Sophists despised his refusal to charge fees or teach for profit. Yet Socrates could not stop. He believed that living without questioning was a betrayal of the soul. The unexamined life, he insisted, was not worth living. Unlike many Athenians, Socrates showed complete disregard for wealth and luxury. He wore the same cloak year-round, walked barefoot, and ate simple meals. He often turned down opportunities for political advancement, refusing to compromise his principles for power. When friends urged him to take office, he replied that he lacked the talent for politics, meaning not ability, but the willingness to flatter, deceive, or pander to the masses. His independence set him apart from both sophists and statesmen. This lifestyle was not ascetic for its own sake. It was philosophical. Socrates believed that true happiness came not from possessions, but from cultivating the soul. Virtue, not wealth, was the measure of a good life. It was during this time that Socrates began to attract young followers who admired his courage, his logic, and his refusal to bow to convention. Among them were Plato, who would immortalize him, Xenophon, who recorded his conversations, and Alcibiades, the brilliant but reckless statesman whose turbulent career would later haunt Socrates' reputation. These young men found in Socrates a model of integrity, a man who lived what he taught, even if his teachings were unsettling. With Socrates, philosophy underwent a profound transformation. No longer was it about the composition of matter or the mechanics of the cosmos. Instead, it became about ethics, virtue, and the meaning of life. Socrates shifted the focus from nature to the soul, from speculation to dialogue, from theory to practice. He demanded that philosophy not just explain the world, but change the way people lived within it. By the time he reached middle age, Socrates had established himself as a unique figure in Athens. He was known in the streets and marketplaces not as a teacher of rhetoric, nor as a writer, nor as a politician, but as a man who questioned relentlessly. His life, his habits, and his words all pointed to the same conviction that truth mattered more than comfort and virtue mattered more than survival. The birth of Socrates as a philosopher was not a single event, but a gradual awakening, a realization that his mission was not to explain the heavens, but to guide humanity toward wisdom. It was this mission that would bring him fame, followers, enemies, and ultimately a trial that would seal his fate. At the core of Socrates' legacy lies a simple but radical practice, questioning. Unlike the sophists, who delivered polished speeches and taught persuasive rhetoric, Socrates engaged his fellow Athenians in open-ended conversations. He rarely offered answers of his own. Instead, he asked questions designed to probe, challenge, and dismantle assumptions. This approach was not mere debate. It was a disciplined search for truth, a tool for exposing ignorance and awakening the soul. Today, we call it the Socratic method. In his time, it was simply the way he lived, an endless dialogue aimed at uncovering wisdom. The Socratic method typically unfolded in stages. A claim is made. Socrates would begin by asking someone a seemingly simple question. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? The person would confidently offer a definition. Cross-examination. Socrates would then test the definition by asking follow-up questions. Did their answer apply consistently? Did it hold up in every situation? Inevitably, contradictions appeared, aporia, puzzlement. The person, realizing their definition was inadequate, would fall into confusion, what Socrates called aporia. Far from being humiliating, Socrates saw this as progress. Recognizing ignorance was the first step toward genuine wisdom, a search for truth. Together, Socrates and his interlocutor would attempt to refine or rebuild the definition, moving closer to clarity. The process rarely produced final answers, but it always sharpened understanding. When speaking to soldiers or statesmen, Socrates might ask, "What is courage?" A young man might answer, "Courage is standing firm in battle." But Socrates would push further. Is retreating wisely also courage? Is a reckless charge courageous or foolish? Bit by bit, the conversation would reveal that courage was not mere physical bravery, but a deeper quality endurance guided by wisdom. Through such dialogues, Socrates showed that virtue was not a matter of opinion or tradition, but something that could be examined, defined, and pursued. Socrates rarely held private lessons. Instead, he conducted philosophy in the public spaces of Athens, especially the agora, the bustling marketplace. Surrounded by merchants, craftsmen, and passers-by, he would engage anyone willing to converse. His audiences included politicians, sophists, soldiers, and curious youths. To some, this was thrilling. To others, it was deeply irritating. By questioning publicly, Socrates forced Athenians to confront their ignorance in front of others. This exposure often embarrassed powerful men. It also won him loyal followers, particularly among the young, who admired his courage and clarity. The Socratic method was both admired and feared. To admirers, it was a breath of fresh air, cutting through hypocrisy and showing that truth mattered more than eloquence. To critics, it was dangerous. By questioning everything, including the gods, traditions, and political leaders, Socrates seemed to undermine the foundations of society. His refusal to offer definitive answers left some feeling that he tore down wisdom without building it back up. This tension explains why Socrates could be beloved by his disciples, yet despised by those in power. His method was not just intellectual, it was revolutionary. For Socrates, questioning was not a trick of argument, but a way of life. He believed that the health of the soul depended on constant examination. Just as athletes trained their bodies, citizens had to train their minds through dialogue. The pursuit of truth was not optional. It was the highest calling of a human being. His insistence on this mission gave him an almost prophetic aura. He was not content to live quietly or conform to convention. He saw himself as serving a divine mandate, a voice within him, his daimonion, that guided his choices and prevented him from acting unjustly. The Socratic method was thus not just an intellectual tool, it was a sacred duty. Yet this very duty sowed the seeds of conflict. Politicians disliked being exposed as ignorant. Sophists resented his refusal to charge money, which made their own fees look suspect. Traditionalists accused him of corrupting the youth by teaching them to question their elders. And when Athens faced political instability and military defeat, such questioning looked less like philosophy and more like rebellion. The Socratic method, then, was not just philosophy, it was a threat to the order of the city. It would ultimately become the central issue in his trial and execution. Socrates did not confine his philosophy to academies or temples. His classroom was the city itself, the agora, gymnasia, workshops, and even military camps. Anyone could become his interlocutor: a proud politician, a celebrated poet, a skilled craftsman, or an unsuspecting passerby. What united these encounters was not the subject matter, but the method, Socratic questioning. Through dialogue, Socrates laid bare the illusions of knowledge and steered his companions toward deeper truths. One of Socrates' favorite targets was the politician. These men often claimed wisdom in matters of justice, governance, and leadership, yet when pressed, their confidence dissolved. For example, when a statesman defined justice as helping friends and harming enemies, Socrates asked, "But is it just to harm anyone? Does justice consist of making men worse?" The questioning revealed that justice could not be so simply defined, and that harming even enemies was inconsistent with virtue. Such exchanges embarrassed powerful figures. To the public, it looked as though Socrates made fools of the city's leaders. To Socrates, it was necessary. How could Athens claim to be just if its leaders could not even define justice? Socrates also sought out poets, men revered for their verses and insights into the divine. He would ask them to explain the wisdom contained in their works. Often they could not. They admitted they had written under inspiration, without fully understanding the meaning of their words. From this, Socrates concluded that poets did not possess true knowledge. They were like vessels through which the gods spoke, but they themselves lacked comprehension. This distinction angered poets, who considered themselves teachers of wisdom, but it also humbled listeners, reminding them that fame did not equal understanding. Craftsmen, unlike politicians and poets, often fared better in Socratic questioning. They possessed genuine knowledge of their trades. Carpenters, sculptors, and shoemakers knew the skills of their craft. Socrates admired this practical wisdom. Yet when they claimed that their expertise in one area gave them authority in others, such as politics or morality, Socrates exposed their overconfidence. This reinforced one of his central lessons. Knowing something specific is not the same as knowing the good. Technical skill is valuable, but it does not replace moral wisdom. Perhaps Socrates' most contentious encounters were with the sophists. These professional teachers specialized in rhetoric and persuasion, training young men to succeed in politics. They charged high fees and often argued that truth was relative. What mattered was the ability to win debates. Socrates despised this. He accused sophists of corrupting youth by teaching them to seek power rather than truth. He insisted that virtue could not be sold, and that persuasion without wisdom was empty. One famous sophist, Protagoras, declared, "Man is the measure of all things." Socrates responded by asking, "If each person's perception is true, how can we distinguish wisdom from ignorance?" His relentless questioning revealed the dangers of relativism, even as it irritated sophists and their wealthy patrons. Despite, or perhaps because of his confrontations with authority, Socrates attracted many young followers. They admired his courage in challenging the powerful and his refusal to be swayed by wealth or popularity. To them, he embodied the ideal of intellectual freedom. Among these youths were men who would later shape history: Plato, who became the greatest philosopher of his age, Xenophon, the soldier and historian, and Alcibiades, the brilliant but reckless general. Their devotion to Socrates fueled his reputation, but also deepened suspicion that he was corrupting the young with dangerous ideas. Socrates did not limit himself to elites. He often engaged ordinary Athenians in conversation. To a farmer, he might ask what it meant to cultivate the land well, and then whether cultivating the soul required similar care. To a merchant, he might ask what fairness meant in trade, and whether fairness applied equally in politics. These conversations revealed Socrates' genius. He could turn everyday experiences into philosophical lessons. To him, every life, no matter how humble, was worth examining. These dialogues made Socrates a public spectacle. Crowds gathered to watch him question the confident and leave them speechless. Aristophanes satirized him in the Clouds, portraying him as a sophist who corrupted youth and mocked the gods. Though exaggerated, the play reflected a real perception. Socrates was a man who unsettled the city, exposing ignorance and challenging tradition in ways that entertained some and enraged others. Despite his unremarkable appearance and simple lifestyle, Socrates drew people to him. His unshakable integrity, sharp intellect, and fearless questioning inspired admiration, especially among the youth of Athens. They gathered around him in the agora, eager to listen, argue, and learn. This informal circle of companions became both his strength and his vulnerability. Their devotion spread his influence, but their actions also cast shadows over his reputation. Among all Socrates' followers, Plato stands as the most famous. Born into an aristocratic family, Plato abandoned his political ambitions after witnessing the trial and execution of his teacher. He immortalized Socrates in a series of dialogues: Apology, Crito, Phaedo, Symposium, Republic, where Socrates became the central character and voice of wisdom. Through Plato, Socrates' philosophy lived on not only in Athens but across the centuries. Yet during Socrates' lifetime, Plato was just one among many young men enchanted by his teacher's relentless pursuit of truth. Their relationship was not master and student in the conventional sense, but one of dialogue, friendship, and shared inquiry. Another disciple, Xenophon, was a soldier, historian, and writer. Unlike Plato's philosophical works, Xenophon's Memorabilia and Apology of Socrates painted a more practical, down-to-earth picture of his teacher. Xenophon admired Socrates' discipline, moderation, and ability to withstand hardship. To him, Socrates was not only a philosopher, but also a model of virtue in action. Though less profound than Plato's writings, Xenophon's accounts provided valuable confirmation that Socrates was indeed the man of principle described in the dialogues. Together, Plato and Xenophon preserved his legacy, ensuring that his ideas outlived the city that condemned him. Perhaps the most controversial of Socrates' followers was Alcibiades. Handsome, eloquent, and ambitious, Alcibiades was a rising star in Athenian politics. He was also reckless, self-indulgent, and often accused of betraying Athens for personal gain. Alcibiades admired Socrates deeply, even claiming that only Socrates made him feel ashamed of his pursuit of pleasure and power. Socrates, for his part, saved Alcibiades' life in battle and saw in him great potential. Yet Alcibiades' actions, his shifting loyalties during the Peloponnesian War, his scandalous behavior, and his eventual defection to Sparta and later Persia damaged Socrates' reputation. Critics argued that if such a corrupt and dangerous man had been a student of Socrates, then Socrates himself must have corrupted him. Alcibiades became one of the prosecution's unspoken witnesses at Socrates' trial, his notoriety casting a long shadow over the philosopher's name. Even more damaging than Alcibiades was Critias, another former associate of Socrates. Critias was one of the 30 tyrants, the oligarchic rulers who seized power in Athens after its defeat in the Peloponnesian War. His brutal policies and violent purges left lasting scars on the city. Critics did not forget that Critias had once walked alongside Socrates, engaging in his conversations. If the student became a tyrant, they reasoned, the teacher must have planted the seeds of corruption, though Socrates himself opposed injustice, even defying the 30. When they ordered him to participate in an unlawful act, the guilt of association stuck. Beyond these prominent figures, countless other young Athenians followed Socrates. Some came from wealthy families, eager to sharpen their minds. Others were drawn by curiosity, seeking entertainment in his debates. Parents often worried. Their sons, instead of focusing on traditional duties, spent their days in Socratic dialogue, questioning authority and laughing at the ignorance of elders. This perception that Socrates encouraged disrespect for tradition fed into the charge of corrupting the youth. His disciples' enthusiasm became both a testament to his influence and a weapon in his enemies' hands. The circle around Socrates embodied the paradox of his life. Through them, his ideas spread, shaping Athens and, eventually, the entire Western tradition. Yet through them also came suspicion, resentment, and ultimately condemnation. His disciples revealed the power of philosophy to inspire, but also the dangers of association in a city riven by political strife. Socrates himself insisted that each person was responsible for their own choices. But in the eyes of Athens, the actions of Alcibiades and Critias were proof enough that Socrates' questioning had dangerous consequences. Socrates' lifetime overlapped with one of the most destructive conflicts in Greek history, the Peloponnesian War, 431-404 BCE. This decades-long struggle between Athens and Sparta was not just a clash of armies, but a battle between two ways of life, Athens' democracy and empire against Sparta's militaristic oligarchy. For Athenians, the war began with confidence. Their navy dominated the seas, their walls protected the city, and their culture seemed destined for greatness. But as the years dragged on, the cost grew unbearable. Plague, famine, military defeats, political upheavals, and betrayal by allies. Athens' shining glory dimmed under the strain of war. Socrates himself took part in several campaigns. At Potidaea, Delium, and Amphipolis, he fought bravely as a hoplite. His conduct became legendary. Plato and Xenophon described how Socrates showed not only physical courage, but also calm endurance, retreating in order rather than fleeing in panic when battles turned. His military service gave him credibility. He was not just a philosopher of words, but a man who had proven his virtue on the battlefield. This experience also shaped his teaching. He saw firsthand how fear, ambition, and ignorance led men to disaster. For him, true courage was not blind bravery, but knowledge of what is worth fearing and what is not. In war, as in life, ignorance was the greatest danger. Athens during Socrates' early life was led by Pericles, a statesman whose vision and leadership made the city the envy of the Greek world. Under him, democracy flourished and cultural achievements multiplied. But Pericles' death during a plague in 429 BCE left Athens without stable leadership. The city began lurching between demagogues, charismatic men who manipulated the assembly for personal gain. Socrates watched as the ideals of democracy gave way to populism, fear, and rash decisions. His distrust of political leaders grew, reinforcing his conviction that wisdom, not rhetoric, was the foundation of good leadership. Among the shifting leaders was Alcibiades, Socrates' former companion. Brilliant, charming, and reckless, Alcibiades convinced Athens to launch the Sicilian expedition 415 BCE, a massive military campaign aimed at conquering Syracuse. Socrates opposed the venture, warning against the arrogance of overreach. History proved him right. The expedition ended in catastrophe, with thousands of Athenians killed or enslaved. When Alcibiades was later accused of sacrilege and defected to Sparta, critics pointed to his connection with Socrates. Wasn't this the same man Socrates had guided and saved in battle? If such a student betrayed Athens, what did that say about his teacher? Socrates' reputation became entangled with the political failures of his companions. Athens' final humiliation came in 404 BCE, when Sparta triumphed. The city's walls were torn down, its empire dissolved, and democracy briefly replaced by an oligarchic regime known as the 30 Tyrants. Among these rulers was Critias, another of Socrates' former associates. The 30 ruled with brutality, executing hundreds of citizens and seizing property. Their tyranny stained Athens with fear and resentment. Though Socrates opposed their injustice, he even refused, when ordered to participate in an unlawful arrest. His link to Critias again raised suspicion. To many Athenians, it seemed that Socrates' teachings bred corruption in the very men who had destroyed their democracy. In 403 BCE, democracy was restored after the overthrow of the 30. Athens, though battered and humiliated, reclaimed its political identity. But the scars ran deep. Citizens wanted stability, unity, and a return to traditional values. Suspicion of dissent, unorthodox ideas, and those linked to traitors grew sharper. Socrates, with his relentless questioning, his connections to Alcibiades and Critias, and his reputation for challenging the gods and corrupting the youth, became an easy target. In a city desperate for order, he embodied the very spirit of disruption. The turmoil of Athens was the crucible in which Socrates' fate was sealed. He lived in a city torn between democracy and tyranny, war and peace, pride and defeat. His philosophy, which might have been tolerated in calmer times, now seemed dangerous. The city wanted stability. Socrates offered only more questions. The city wanted unity. Socrates exposed division. The city wanted certainty. Socrates admitted ignorance. Thus, the stage was set for his trial. Athens, weary of turmoil, would turn against the man who claimed to be its gadfly. By the late 5th century BCE, Athens was a city deeply scarred. The Peloponnesian War had ended in defeat. The brief but brutal reign of the 30 tyrants had shaken faith in leadership. Even with democracy restored, wounds remained raw, and suspicion hung heavy in the air. In such a climate, Athens looked for scapegoats, those whose ideas, actions, or associations could be blamed for the city's suffering. Socrates, with his relentless questioning, his disdain for authority, and his notorious disciples like Alcibiades and Critias became a prime target. His gadfly mission, once merely irritating, now seemed dangerous. In 399 BCE, 3 Athenians brought charges against Socrates. Miletus, a young poet; Anytus, a powerful politician and defender of democracy; Lycon, a rhetorician. The charges were twofold: impiety, failing to acknowledge the gods of the city and introducing new divinities; corrupting the youth, leading the younger generation to question authority, tradition, and religion. These accusations struck at the heart of Athenian identity. Piety toward the gods ensured divine favor, loyalty to tradition secured civic unity. To accuse someone of impiety and corruption was to paint them as a danger to both heaven and earth. Though framed as religious and moral concerns, the charges were deeply political. Socrates' association with Alcibiades, the traitor, and Critias, the tyrant, loomed large in the public imagination. Even if Socrates had opposed their worst actions, his connection to them seemed incriminating. Furthermore, Anytus had personal motives. As a leader in restoring democracy, he may have viewed Socrates' questioning spirit as a threat to fragile stability. Eliminating him would serve as both a warning and a reassurance to citizens eager to protect their system. The trial took place before a jury of 501 Athenian citizens chosen by lot. Trials in Athens were public and often theatrical, more akin to civic rituals than modern legal proceedings. Each side presented speeches, and jurors voted without deliberation. Socrates' accusers portrayed him as a dangerous innovator, mocking the gods and filling young minds with doubt. They linked him implicitly to the city's disasters, hinting that his teachings had helped shape the betrayers and tyrants who brought Athens low. Socrates, however, refused to grovel or flatter the jury. In Plato's Apology, his defense is bold, ironic, and uncompromising. On impiety, he argued that he did believe in divine powers, since he was guided by his inner daimonion, a divine sign that restrained him from wrongdoing. If he acknowledged such a voice, how could he be accused of atheism? On corruption, he insisted that he never intentionally harmed anyone. If he had corrupted the youth, it was unintentional, and the law did not punish accidents. Moreover, his questioning encouraged virtue, not vice. Most strikingly, Socrates declared that his mission was divinely ordained. To stop questioning would be to disobey the gods. The unexamined life, he said, is not worth living. Rather than appealing to pity, Socrates spoke with defiance. He did not beg for mercy or parade his family to sway emotions, as was common practice. Instead, he told the jurors that killing him would harm Athens more than him. He was the city's gadfly, sent to awaken it from complacency. Silencing him would silence a divine gift. This courage or arrogance angered many jurors. Instead of appearing humble, Socrates seemed to challenge their authority. When the votes were counted, Socrates was found guilty. The margin was narrow, perhaps only by a few dozen votes out of 501. The jury then moved to sentencing. Athenian law allowed the convicted to propose an alternative punishment. Socrates, half in jest, suggested he should be rewarded with free meals for life at the Prytaneum, the hall reserved for Olympic champions. Finally, he offered to pay a fine, supported by his friends. But the jury, offended by his refusal to repent, chose the harsher penalty. Socrates was sentenced to death, to be carried out by drinking a cup of poison hemlock. The trial of Socrates was more than a legal case. It was a clash between philosophy and politics, free inquiry and civic order, truth and tradition. Athens condemned not just a man, but the spirit of relentless questioning he embodied. For Socrates, the outcome was proof of his mission. A philosopher must be willing to die for the truth. For Athens, it was a warning stability mattered more than dissent. When Plato recorded Socrates' defense speech in the Apology, he gave the world one of philosophy's most enduring texts. It was not an apology in the modern sense of regret, but in the ancient sense of apologia, a defense. Far from begging for mercy, Socrates used the trial to explain and justify his mission, turning the courtroom into a stage for philosophy. His words, preserved for centuries, became a manifesto of intellectual courage. Socrates began by contrasting himself with his accusers. They had prepared polished speeches filled with rhetoric and appeals to emotion. He, however, would speak plainly, in the manner I am accustomed to speak in the marketplace. This refusal to perform was itself a challenge to the jury. He would not flatter, manipulate, or play games. He would defend himself with truth. From the beginning, Socrates positioned himself as different from other men of Athens, not a sophist, not a politician, but a seeker of wisdom. Before answering the formal charges, Socrates addressed older prejudices. For years, comedians like Aristophanes had mocked him as a sophist who mocked the gods and speculated absurdly about the heavens. These impressions, he argued, made jurors predisposed to see him as guilty. He insisted that he was not a sophist, took no money, and never claimed to teach. Instead, he only asked questions, seeking truth in dialogue. By clearing this ground, Socrates showed that the trial was not just about law, but about reputation and misunderstanding. On the charge of impiety, Socrates made two key arguments. Belief in a daimonion. Socrates described the divine inner voice that guided him, preventing him from making wrong decisions. How, he asked, could he be accused of atheism if he believed in divine signs? Service to the god at Delphi. He recounted the story of the oracle at Delphi, which had declared that no man was wiser than Socrates. His entire mission, he explained, was to test this pronouncement by questioning others. His search for truth was not rebellion, but obedience to Apollo. Thus, Socrates reframed himself not as impious, but as uniquely pious, serving the gods by pursuing wisdom. On the accusation of corrupting the youth, Socrates asked, "Who improves the youth?" His accuser Meletus claimed that all Athenians improved them, except Socrates. Socrates pointed out the absurdity. In matters of horses or crafts, only a few experts improve, while the majority corrupt. How could human virtue be so different? He further argued that if he had corrupted the youth, it was unintentional and the law punished intentional crimes. Moreover, many of his followers testified that they had not been harmed, but improved by his questioning. The charge, he suggested, was baseless. Perhaps the most powerful part of the apology was Socrates' declaration of his divine mission. He compared himself to a gadfly sent by the gods to sting the great but sluggish horse of Athens into wakefulness. Without him, the city would sink into complacency. His role was not to comfort, but to provoke. Men of Athens, he said, I am that gadfly. This metaphor captured the essence of his philosophy, relentless, uncomfortable, but necessary. Socrates' defense was not humble. He warned the jury that condemning him would harm Athens more than him. He told them he could not stop questioning, even if it meant death, because the unexamined life is not worth living. This was the heart of his message. Life without reflection, without pursuit of virtue, was empty. Better to die seeking truth than to live in ignorance. Such defiance shocked the jury. Socrates did not fear death. He feared only injustice and dishonor. His courage elevated the trial into a moral drama where philosophy stood against politics. After being found guilty, Athenian law required Socrates to propose an alternative punishment. In a gesture of irony, he first suggested that he be rewarded with free meals at the Prytaneum, the hall reserved for Olympic heroes. Only after his friends urged him did he propose a modest fine, which they pledged to pay. This refusal to apologize or repent sealed his fate. The jury, angered by his boldness, voted for death. In his final speech, Socrates remained serene. He reminded the jurors that death was not to be feared. It was either a peaceful sleep or a journey to another place where he could converse with heroes and philosophers of the past. Either way, it was no evil. To those who had voted for his acquittal, he left a prophecy. Silencing him would not silence philosophy. Others would arise to question and challenge, perhaps even more sharply than he had. With these words, Socrates turned defeat into triumph. Though condemned, he left Athens and the world a legacy of moral courage and intellectual honesty. When the jury condemned Socrates to death in 399 BCE, he was not executed immediately. A sacred religious festival delayed all executions for several weeks. During this time, Socrates remained in prison, awaiting the hemlock. Far from despairing, he used the time as he always had, in conversation with his friends, questioning, teaching, and reflecting on the deepest matters of life and death. Plato's dialogues, Crito and Phaedo, preserve these final days, turning Socrates' imprisonment into a stage for some of the most profound philosophy ever recorded. One of Socrates' closest friends, Crito, visited him in prison with urgent news. Arrangements had been made for Socrates to escape. Friends had bribed the guards, a safe refuge awaited him in Thessaly, and money was no obstacle. Crito begged Socrates to seize the chance. Remaining meant certain death. But Socrates refused. His reasoning revealed his steadfast commitment to justice, the opinion of the many. Crito argued that people would think Socrates' friends were cowards if they let him die. Socrates replied that the opinions of the many did not matter, only the judgment of the wise. What was true and just outweighed popular perception. The social contract. Socrates personified the laws of Athens, imagining them speaking to him. They reminded him that he had lived in Athens all his life, accepted its benefits, and never left when free to do so. By staying, he had implicitly agreed to obey its laws, even if they condemned him unjustly. To break the laws now would be to harm the city and betray his principles. Justice above life. Escaping would save his life, but destroy his integrity. Better to die justly than to live unjustly. As he told Crito, one must never do wrong, even in return for wrong. This dialogue revealed Socrates' unwavering commitment. The philosopher's duty was not to survival, but to justice. As the day of execution drew near, Socrates gathered with his friends for a final conversation. In Plato's Phaedo, this meeting becomes a meditation on death and the soul. Socrates argued that a true philosopher does not fear death. Why? Because philosophy is, in a sense, a preparation for death. By detaching the soul from bodily desires and focusing on truth, the philosopher practices for the soul's release from the body. He offered several arguments for the immortality of the soul. The argument from opposites. Life and death, like waking and sleeping, exist in cycles. Just as the living come from the dead must return to life. The theory of recollection. Humans possess knowledge, such as of perfect equality or beauty, that they could not have learned through the senses. Therefore, the soul must have existed before birth, carrying knowledge from a previous existence. The affinity argument. The body is mortal and perishable, but the soul resembles the divine, invisible and eternal. Thus, the soul is more likely to survive death. The final harmony argument. The soul, as the principle of life, cannot admit its opposite death. Therefore, it is indestructible. For his friends, these arguments were both comforting and challenging. Socrates spoke with calm conviction, while they wept at the thought of losing him. Throughout these dialogues, Socrates remained serene. He joked with friends, reminded them not to fear, and insisted that death was not an evil. His composure astonished all who witnessed it. Here was a man condemned unjustly, yet unshaken, living his final days with the same devotion to truth that had guided his entire life. Socrates' prison became not a place of despair, but a final classroom. In it, he showed that philosophy was not words alone, but a way of life and of dying. Through Credo and Phaedo, Socrates taught his companions and us that justice, virtue, and the soul's well-being matter more than survival. By rejecting escape, he affirmed the principle that laws must be respected, even when unjustly applied. By embracing death with peace, he showed that the soul transcends the body. His prison dialogues were not only philosophical treatises, they were acts of courage, demonstrations of integrity, and the ultimate proof that philosophy could guide one not only in life, but in facing death. The sun rose over Athens, and with it came the end of Socrates' earthly journey. After weeks of delay due to the sacred festival of Delos, during which executions were suspended, the time had come. The prison cell that had echoed with dialogue, laughter, and philosophical speculation was now the stage for his final act. Plato's Phaedo provides the most vivid account. He tells us that Socrates spent his last morning as he had spent so many others conversing with his friends. There was no panic, no despair, only calm reflection. His companions, however, were torn by grief. Their beloved teacher, whose words had guided them for years, was about to be silenced by the city he had sought to serve. Accounts differ, but one detail resonates across traditions. Socrates bid farewell to his wife Xanthippe and his children. Xanthippe reportedly wept bitterly, lamenting his fate. Socrates, ever steady, asked that she be escorted out so that the atmosphere would remain composed. His concern was not for himself, but for the state of mind of those around him. He wanted philosophy, not despair, to mark his final moments. When the appointed hour arrived, the jailer entered with the cup of poison. Hemlock, a deadly plant, was the prescribed method of execution in Athens. Mixed into a drink, it caused paralysis that crept upward from the legs until it reached the heart. The jailer, moved by Socrates' dignity, wept as he handed him the cup. Socrates received it without fear, asking calmly what he should do. When told to walk until his legs grew heavy, he nodded. Holding the cup, he spoke his final words of instruction, urging his companions to remain courageous and not to disgrace themselves with lamentation. Then, without hesitation, he drank. The room erupted in grief, but Socrates rebuked them gently. "Be calm and bear up." He reminded them that death was not to be feared. To him, it was either a dreamless sleep or a passage to another realm where he might converse with heroes and philosophers of old. Either way, it was no evil. As the poison took hold, he walked until his legs weakened. He lay down as instructed and covered himself with a cloth. Slowly, the numbness spread upward. His friends, unable to restrain their sorrow, wept openly. Just before the poison reached his heart, Socrates uncovered his face and spoke his final words. "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not neglect it." The meaning of these words has long been debated. Asclepius was the god of healing. Many believe Socrates meant that death was a cure, a release from the sickness of mortal life. Others interpret it as a symbolic reminder that philosophy itself was a form of healing for the soul. Whatever the case, his final words were not of bitterness or regret, but of duty and gratitude. Moments later, his body stiffened. The greatest gadfly of Athens was gone. For his friends, the silence that followed was unbearable. Plato, who claimed to have been absent due to illness, described the scene with solemn reverence. Xenophon, too, remembered Socrates' death as the noblest of endings. Athens had silenced him, but in doing so, it transformed him into something greater. His death became a symbol. The philosopher who chose principle over survival truth over compromise, and integrity over fear. The death of Socrates marked more than the end of a man. It marked the birth of philosophy as a moral vocation. By accepting death rather than abandoning his mission, Socrates gave future generations a model of intellectual courage. His hemlock became a chalice of wisdom, drunk symbolically by every thinker who has dared to question authority in the name of truth. For Athens, the execution was a wound that never healed. For the world, it was the beginning of an immortal legacy. The execution of Socrates in 399 BCE might have silenced his voice in Athens, but it amplified his message across history. His death was not a defeat, it was a transformation. What the city intended as punishment became the seed of a legacy that shaped philosophy for millennia. Through his disciples, most notably Plato and, indirectly, Aristotle, Socrates' questions outlived the democracy that condemned him. Socrates left no writings of his own, but this absence became a paradoxical strength. His ideas lived in the words of others, free to evolve and inspire. Plato, in particular, turned the memory of his teacher into a foundation stone for Western thought. Plato, deeply shaken by Socrates' trial and death, devoted his life to preserving and extending his teacher's mission. In his dialogues, Socrates appears not merely as a character, but as a voice of unyielding inquiry. The Apology, Credo, and Phaedo, these works directly recount Socrates' trial, prison conversations, and death. They immortalized him as a martyr for truth and virtue. The Republic, here, Plato uses Socrates to explore justice, the ideal state, and the philosopher king. Socrates becomes the central figure in imagining a society ruled by wisdom rather than power. The Symposium and Theaetetus. In these dialogues, Socrates becomes a master of love and knowledge, a seeker of the forms beyond appearances. His dialectical method becomes the path to ultimate truth. Through Plato, Socrates was no longer just a man of Athens. He became a universal figure, a symbol of the examined life. Aristotle, though a student of Plato rather than Socrates directly, inherited the Socratic spirit through the academy. While he often disagreed with Plato, Aristotle preserved key elements of Socratic philosophy. The search for definitions. Socrates' insistence on defining justice, courage, and virtue influenced Aristotle's own quest to classify and define the principles of ethics, politics, and science. Virtu a centrau, Socrates taught that knowledge and virtue were connected. Aristotle expanded this into a comprehensive theory of virtue ethics, where moral character and practical wisdom form the basis of the good life. Philosophy as a way of life. Socrates lived philosophy. Aristotle, while more systematic, continued the idea that philosophy was not abstract speculation alone, but a guide to human flourishing, eudaimonia. Though Aristotle moved far beyond Socrates in scope, the Socratic commitment to inquiry and moral seriousness remained at the core of his philosophy. Through Plato and Aristotle, Socrates became the fountainhead of Western philosophy. His questioning spirit lived on in every school of thought that followed. Stoicism embraced his calm in the face of death. Christian thinkers saw in him a pagan precursor to martyrdom for truth. Modern philosophers from Descartes to Kant admired his insistence on reason. Legal and political theorists invoked his trial as a warning about the dangers of suppressing free thought. Without Socrates, Plato might never have written his dialogues. Without Plato, Aristotle might never have built his system. Without them, philosophy as we know it might never have emerged. Ironically, Athens condemned Socrates to protect itself, but his death did more to change the world than his life could have alone. By silencing him, the city amplified his voice across time. His legacy proved that ideas cannot be executed. Every generation since has returned to Socrates, drawn by his humility, courage, and relentless questions. His life became a challenge. Are we willing to examine ourselves as he did? His death became a warning. What happens to societies that fear truth? Plato and Aristotle carried Socrates' spirit forward, but his true disciples are countless. Every philosopher who values truth above comfort, every student who dares to question authority, every citizen who asks what justice really means, each is part of Socrates' lineage. He was executed in a small corner of Athens, but his classroom is now the world. Socrates began as an eccentric figure in Athens, barefoot, poor, endlessly questioning. Yet his death elevated him into something larger than life. He became not just a philosopher, but a symbol of courage, of truth, of resistance to authority. Over time, his image was reshaped, reinterpreted, and woven into the cultural imagination of civilizations far beyond Athens. Aristophanes' Satire. Even during his lifetime, Socrates appeared as a character in Aristophanes' The Clouds. There, he was mocked as a sophist floating in a basket, teaching young men to disrespect tradition. This caricature contributed to his unpopularity, but also preserved him as a recognizable cultural figure. Plato's Dialogues. Plato transformed Socrates from a man into an eternal voice of wisdom. The dialogues ensured that every generation could hear Socrates questioning anew. Through Plato's pen, the philosopher became immortalized as both a martyr and a teacher. Xenophon's Accounts. Xenophon's writings, though less profound, presented Socrates as a practical moral guide. Together with Plato, they cemented his place in the literary canon. Socrates became a touchstone for political thought. His trial was remembered as one of the earliest examples of a state punishing free inquiry. Philosophers and political theorists drew parallels between his fate and their own struggles. Stoics like Epictetus admired his calm acceptance of death. Roman thinkers such as Cicero invoked him as the wisest of Greeks. Enlightenment figures like Voltaire and Rousseau praised him as a martyr for reason against superstition. His example reminded thinkers that philosophy was not a luxury, but a necessity, and that truth often comes into conflict with power. Strikingly, Socrates' death resonated far beyond philosophy. Early Christian writers saw in him a parallel to Christ, a man unjustly condemned who embraced death for the sake of truth and who inspired disciples to carry on his teachings. Justin Martyr, an early Christian apologist, called Socrates a Christian before Christ because he followed reason, the Logos, rather than false gods. St. Augustine admired his humility and pursuit of virtue, even if he lacked revelation. In this way, Socrates became not only a pagan philosopher, but also a spiritual precursor, bridging Greek reason and Christian faith. Artists through the centuries immortalized Socrates' final moment. The most famous image is Jacques-Louis David's painting, The Death of Socrates, 1787, where the philosopher, surrounded by grieving disciples, calmly reaches for the cup of hemlock. His upright posture contrasts with their despair, symbolizing reason's triumph over fear. Other depictions show him debating in the marketplace or deep in conversation with Plato. In each, the emphasis is on his serenity, wisdom, and defiance. He became a visual icon of philosophy itself. Socrates' influence did not end with antiquity. His name appears in novels, plays, political speeches, and even popular media. He is invoked whenever someone dares to stand against the majority, when truth clashes with power, or when education is defined as more than memorization. Philosophy classrooms worldwide use the Socratic method. Political dissidents invoke his trial as a warning against tyranny. Writers and filmmakers portray him as the archetype of the wise man unjustly condemned. The barefoot Athenian has become an enduring archetype, the philosopher who risks everything for truth. Yet Socrates' cultural image has always been dual. To admirers, he is a hero of reason, a martyr for philosophy, a saint of intellectual courage. To critics, he remains the disruptive gadfly, the corrupter of youth, the man who challenged traditions so recklessly that his city had no choice but to silence him. This tension hero or troublemaker keeps Socrates alive in cultural memory. He resists being simplified just as he resisted easy answers in life. More than 2 millennia later, Socrates is no longer just an Athenian. He is universal. His questions belong to no city, no era, no single tradition. He has become a cultural icon not because he offered answers, but because he embodied the courage to ask. In this sense, Socrates is not only remembered, he is still with us every time we confront authority, question assumptions, or choose principle over comfort. Socrates lived as a poor man in the streets of Athens, barefoot and indifferent to wealth or status. He wrote nothing, held no office of power, and left no systematic philosophy. Yet he became one of the most influential figures in human history. His paradox is striking. A man who claimed to know nothing transformed the way humanity thinks about everything. He was condemned as impious, yet he may have been the most pious of Athenians, obeying what he believed to be a divine mission. He was accused of corrupting the youth, yet his disciples carried his thought across centuries, shaping entire civilizations. Athens sought to silence him, but in doing so gave him a voice that has never been silenced. For Socrates, philosophy was not a profession, nor an academic discipline. It was a way of life. To question, to examine, to pursue virtue relentlessly, this was his calling. He showed that philosophy was not about abstract theories alone, but about how one should live and die. His example redefined wisdom. To admit ignorance was not weakness, but strength. To seek truth was not arrogance, but duty. To live virtuously was not optional, but essential. In his life and in his death, Socrates showed that philosophy is not a luxury of the few, but the responsibility of all. Perhaps his most famous declaration, "The unexamined life is not worth living," remains his eternal challenge. It asks each generation, do we truly reflect on our choices, our values, our society? Or do we drift through life unthinking, content with illusions and conventions? This statement continues to provoke unease. It is not an easy comfort, but a demand. Socrates insists that to be human is to question. To refuse that is to betray our very nature. The trial and death of Socrates also serve as a warning. Athens, the proud birthplace of democracy, condemned its greatest questioner. Fear, resentment, and the desire for stability outweighed tolerance for dissent. In silencing Socrates, the city revealed the fragility of freedom. The lesson is universal. Societies that fear criticism risk destroying the very voices that keep them alive. The fate of Socrates asks us to consider, are we willing to tolerate discomfort for the sake of truth, or do we silence those who unsettle us? Socrates called himself a gadfly, stinging Athens into awareness. In truth, he became a gadfly for all of humanity. His questions continue to buzz in classrooms, in courts, in political debates, and in the hearts of individuals who wrestle with meaning. Every time we ask, what is justice? What is virtue? What is the good life? We echo Socrates. Every time we resist easy answers and probe deeper, we carry forward his mission. In the end, Socrates left no doctrine, only a method, no dogma, only questions. His greatness lies not in providing final answers, but in awakening the human spirit to inquiry. His death by hemlock was not an end, but a beginning, a moment that turned one man's questioning into humanity's eternal dialogue. And so the story of Socrates leaves us where he left his companions, with questions, not conclusions. What is wisdom, and do we truly seek it? What is justice, and do we live by it? What is the good life, And are we living it or merely existing? Socrates does not answer. He never did. He only asks, and in doing so demands that we, too, examine our lives.